Male temptations. Because of the old sin nature, men particularly must always be on guard against the temptation to use women in selfish and egotistical ways. Here now is Gene Getz.
Let me say, first of all, that this principle really emerges in the whole biblical story. All you've got to do is go back to the book of Genesis and trace through what happened after the fall. And one of the things that God said as a result of the fall, and He said this to Eve and to all of her children and her sisters, that men will rule over you, and that's not a command, that's a result of sin, and the word rule there really can be defined as abusive. Men will rule over you, they'll be abusive, they'll take advantage of you, they will use you for their own ends. And what is the history of humanity? Every culture of the world you go to, you'll see that happening. And what turns it around? What turns it away from that kind of abuse? The message of Jesus Christ. You go to a culture that has penetrated the gospel of Jesus Christ, and you will see a change in men's behavior because of conversion to know Jesus Christ and the model that Jesus has given us. Now, what we have here in the book of Esther is a king, and oftentimes we refer to him as Xerxes, but really the name that is used here in the book of Esther in this translation is King Ahasuerus. And he was indeed a very wicked guy. I mean, he took abuse of women to a whole degree lower in relationship to how he treated them. In fact, historians tell us that under his leadership, the whole Persian Empire sunk lower in terms of sexual immorality than even beyond his predecessors, including Cyrus. And the events of the book of Esther here illustrate that. So, let's begin with Esther, chapter 1, verse 2. In those days, King Ahasuerus reigned from his royal throne in the fortress at Susa. So let me give you a little geographical perspective here. If you look at this map, you will see Susa is just a little low the middle, but almost in the center. That's Susa, the capital. Over to the left, west, you'll see Babylon. But the orange territory really represents the whole Persian Empire. Notice all the way down to Egypt. And also most of Turkey, which was Asia Minor. And then you have Iraq to the east, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and all the way over to India. That was the Persian Empire. So this was a huge, huge empire. And Ahasuerus was really proud of his territory and his power. So when it talks about reigning in his royal throne in Susa, he was over all of this empire. Now notice in verse 3 of Esther. He held a feast in the 3rd year of his reign for all his officials and staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles and the officials from the provinces. In other words, there were a lot of people that had come to Susa. Frequently they would travel there, even though they were from other parts of the Persian Empire. So he held this huge feast. In verse 5 we read, at the end of this time, the king held a week-long banquet in the garden courtyard of the royal palace for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were present in the fortress of Susa. In other words, he wanted all of his leaders, all of those people who'd come at that particular time to be a part of this huge banquet. He didn't spare anything in relationship to providing for them. And of course, this was a very prideful act on his part. He was demonstrating his power, his wealth. That was his whole motive in this particular situation. Now, notice as we read along, you get down to verse 10, which says, on the 7th day when the king was feeling good from the wine. And I think you could say he was half drunk, probably, based on his behavior. On the seventh day, when the king was feeling good from the wine, he had been drinking for 7 days, Ahasuerus commanded, and he lists these 7 eunuchs, the 7 eunuchs who personally served him, to bring Queen Vashti before him with her royal crown. These men were eunuchs, not probably by choice, but because they were responsible for his harem. And having them to become eunuchs through his command, he knew they weren't going to be messing around with his women, to be very blunt. They were responsible to oversee all these women in his harem. And so consequently, he wanted to show off her beauty, that is, his queen, to the people and the officials because she was very beautiful. And when the scriptures say very beautiful, it means very beautiful. And it's talking about her whole being. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command that was delivered by his eunuchs. The king became furious and his anger burned within him. And so when he wanted her to come with her crown, in essence, whatever covering she had was very transparent, if she had covering at all, except her crown. He was showing off her body. And she didn't like it. And she had enough guts to say, no way. That's it. And he became furious. Why did he become furious? Because people, men who use women, get very furious and angry when they don't have their way. That was his whole motivation. It was him, his selfishness, his pride, his arrogance, his lasciviousness. This is why he was one of the most evil kings in the whole Persian Empire and brought, in many respects, the Persian Empire to a very low place. Now, his behavior, if you want to understand his behavior, you got to go back to the Garden of Eden. You got to go back to what happened when Adam and Eve sinned. Because following that situation, following what happened in the Garden of Eden, that's when God said the judgment is that men are going to deteriorate and they will rule over you. They will be abusive. They will take advantage for their own ends. And we see that throughout history. See some of the most horrible situations in history and even in many cultures today. Now, this is regression. This is regression when you look at this man and what he did. And God, by the way, did in no way whitewash the behavior of men in the Old Testament or the New Testament. He just lays it all out. And you see that even in the life of men like Abraham. You see it even in a man like David, who was a man after God's heart. And what he did. And how he committed adultery with Bathsheba and then committed murder as a result to cover up his sexual sin. See, God doesn't whitewash it. It's there. This is humanity. And we're seeing a story of this illustrated right here. And when Jesus Christ came, Jesus made a difference. And you remember the woman that was taken in adultery? And they brought her to Jesus. Who were them? The religious leaders. And you ever wondered what Jesus wrote in the sand when he stooped down? I can speculate. I think he wrote the name of every woman they committed adultery with. Those guys themselves who were accusing her. And by the way, where was the man? She was taken in adultery. Why didn't they bring the man? The Old Testament says both are guilty under the law. So you see this element of stupidity coming to Jesus. And one by one, and by the way, from the oldest to the youngest walked out, which means probably the way in which he wrote it in the sand started with the oldest and went right down to the youngest. And Jesus looked up and said, "Where are your accusers?" They're gone. And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." you see Jesus elevating women to a whole new level, dealing with sin as it is reflected among the male community from the point of beginning with the sin in the Garden of Eden. And so the Apostle Paul had to address this issue as well, very clearly, very directly, when he wrote to the Ephesians, when he said, you should no longer walk as the Gentiles walk, because, you see, they were converted out of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was just as bad as the Persian Empire. All you got to do is read about Nero, read about the emperors, and how they treated women. You should no longer walk as the Gentiles walk. They became callous, gave themselves over to promiscuity, practice of every kind of impurity with a desire for more and more. These people, these men were converted out of that. Now, this included men and women because women deteriorate with men. And you see that in Romans chapter 1, where Paul deals with men first, and then he says even women devoted themselves to evil sexual practices. So Paul is dealing with a restoration here in Jesus Christ. And that's why he said to husbands, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her to make her holy, cleansing her with the washing of water by the word. Husbands, can you imagine in the Roman Empire who are used to abuse and having more than one woman in their life, which is very common in the culture? And along comes the Apostle Paul with the gospel and says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, which means being willing to die for her. I mean, that's love. So Jesus brought a whole new standard in the relationship between men and women. And that's the beauty of the gospel. And so the reflection and response question is, what are some specific manifestations of this sinful inclination in men today, even in our culture? Boy, you don't have to look very far. It begins with unfaithfulness. Who are the most unfaithful? Now, it's deteriorating to both men and women, but generally speaking, it's men that are guilty of promiscuity. Then it's spread throughout our cultures where they're actually teaching this is okay for both men and women. Pornography, who is the basis of pornography? Women are involved in it now because it's a very profitable business, but where did it come from? It's men who established it. And pornography is designed primarily for men. Sexual addictions. Sexual addiction. I just read an email today dealing with sexual addictions. And a man who came out of that experience, even as a very religious person. So you see, this is a very relevant principle that relates to us today. So here's the principle. Because of the old sin nature, men particularly must always be on guard against the temptation to use women in selfish and egotistical ways.